When you start to think about your favorite franchise, what tools and other media sources do you use to help you define what the real story of the franchise you're paying attention to is? Is it a book? Is it a movie? Is it those wild fan theories that you can find on YouTube? In today's episode of The Space Wizard Holocron, we discuss Star Wars and what's actually canon to Star Wars and what's not canon. Now, you might be asking yourself, what is canon? And no, we're not talking about the cannons the pirates shoot each other on their ships. We're talking about a general law, rule, or principle, or criterion in which something is judged. It is also the recognized works of a particular artist or author, a collection of lists of sacred books accepted as genuine. Now, no franchise has a history with canon quite like Star Wars has, where it's extremely complicated to keep up and follow along with what's happening in current events when it comes down to actual Star Wars. Arguably, one person to blame for canon conflictions would be George Lucas himself, being the creator of Star Wars. Back in 1993, George Lucas welcomed a whole wave of new authors to come in and design stories for Star Wars that would follow different characters in works that we would eventually call the expanded universe. For some reason, back in 1993, George Lucas knew that his destiny wasn't to continue the aftermath of Star Wars. He knew he could control the precedent past of what Star Wars has become and evolved from to become the original trilogy, but he knew he couldn't take it any further than that. There are always rumors of the George Lucas sequel trilogy, and in some light there was truth to that. When George decided to sell Star Wars to Disney back in 2012 through 2014, there was actually a sequel movie script that George Lucas came up with and pitched for the idea. He knew where the story was going to go, he just didn't want to develop it anymore. From 1993 forward to the release of the prequels, fans seemed to love the idea. A bunch of authors taking their favorite legacy characters on these wild adventures. A lot of fans really enjoy the expanded universe and the stories that it brought to the Star Wars collection. In the early 2000s, Lucas Licensing hired Leland Chee to actually direct and handle all the continuity of Star Wars as a whole. A lot of fans like to say that it's fake news, but it's not. Leland Chee created a tier system known as G Canon, T Canon, and so forth. These were the basic guidelines of the storytelling universe for Star Wars. George Lucas canon relates specifically to the 6 Star Wars films in their most recent incarnations, that would be the special editions from 1997, and their production notes, which I would assume would be anything Lucas had filling in the backstory ideas that directly incorporated around those movies, his storyboards, his deleted scenes, and so forth. T canon represents the animated Star Wars television shows. Continuity canon includes the expanded universe story novels, comics, video games, and content originating from other authors. It could be elevated in canon status if George Lucas added it to a Lucas project. Secondary canon is where it gets a little bit weird because it's material that is ignored or undesired by authors, including older works. And one of the references that they're using in this specific post is Marvel Star Wars comics. Non-canon represents your what-if infinity type stories that have no relation to canon whatsoever and usually contradicts it to some degree. Detour's canon, or D-canon for short, was never defined. We have actually no idea what tier canon this incorporates at all. This is a mystery to both you and me. However, Leland Chee's canon list didn't stay concrete forever. Eventually, that ideology did change. In 2002, George Lucas made a very defining statement for what is Star Wars canon. Cinescape 2002 magazine interview, George Lucas basically had said, there are 2 worlds here. There's my world, which is the movies, and then there's the other worlds that's been created. It is here we have the highest level of Star Wars canon telling the audience directly, what is Star Wars? And that is George Lucas telling you, his world is Star Wars. This other world is a parallel universe, a secondary universe, an adaptation to his own ingenious storytelling. Outside of him approving the continuity for these selected existing stories, he tries not to get too involved in the parallel universe because it is a different story that's being told from George Lucas' Star Wars as a whole. Now, remember, fans love it when other people get the opportunity to tell Star Wars stories. That's why the EU is one of the most beloved set of novels in the entire Star Wars franchise, because it tells stories that fans connect with and thoroughly enjoy. Here's the ironic thing. Leland Chee went from creating a whole different list of different types of continuity to then returning to the point and saying it's all one canon. Ideally, sure, the expanded universe does follow the narrative set by George Lucas' Star Wars. This absolutely is a true statement because there is no continuity breaks for the most part throughout the entire expanded universe. As we see in 2005, Leland Chee steps in and says parallel universes suggest that a universe can go in separate directions, which really isn't the case in regard to the EU. The EU is bound by what is seen in most current versions of films and by directives of George Lucas. So here we have a continuity administrator going against a G-source canon being George Lucas when George says his movies and the EU are two separate entities. Hey, that kind of reminds me when Disney took over Star Wars and said, this is what Star Wars is and this isn't what Star Wars is. By 2008, the precedents became clear thanks to Howard Rothman, president of Lucas Licensing. He basically stated that this is all Star Wars. This is one Star Wars, one canon, in short summary. It's definitely conflicting when you have the original canon source saying one thing and his editors saying other things. So yeah, the EU was canon to Star Wars. It's all one Star Wars from the original standpoint as we got into the ending of that era before George decided to sell it to Disney. So if you've never checked out the Star Wars Expanded Universe, I definitely recommend it for some great narratives that, honestly, we'll probably never really get to see again, thanks to how Star Wars is developing and changing so much. All the authors of those novels did a fantastic job when putting in their work towards their contributions to Star Wars. I give it a thumbs up. However, unfortunately, Disney acquired Lucasfilm and Star Wars, and after 2014, it became apparent that the expanded universe was no longer canon and rebranded as Legends. Thanks to some well-archived interviews and some tweets, we do know that Leland Chee also is behind the restructuring of the canon once again. So, what's ultimately changed in Star Wars canon? Well, not a lot actually. All 6 movies are still canon. All the animated TV shows are still canon. There are still other authors stepping up to create more Star Wars novels and storytelling mechanics for comics and video games, and even as far as now movies and TV shows unlike Lucasfilm before them. The major sense of change seems to be that these authors have stepped up and have done more TV shows and movies in the Star Wars property compared to how Lucasfilm didn't do a whole lot of that in the past due to probably backlash and repercussions of things like their animated series and their, one-off holiday special. That is, to avoid the topic of diving into canceled Star Wars projects under George Lucas and Lucasfilm directive pre-Disney. It's ironic. At one point, fans didn't like George Lucas making Star Wars and preferred other authors stepping up and writing these novels. And now that other authors have stepped up and instead of just writing more novels, they've also started writing TV shows and films, fans no longer like this perspective. It's a little bit weird. So, what is Star Wars canon? Well, that's up for the viewer to decide. Star Wars canon is what you enjoy about Star Wars. It's not about what anybody on the internet tells you. It's not about what Leland Chee is directing you to tell you what Star Wars canon is. It isn't about Lucasfilm storyboard storytelling telling you what's canon. It's about the Star Wars that you love and enjoy, and that's the most important thing at the very end of the day. If you've enjoyed this video, consider giving it the thumbs up. If you like Star Wars and want to talk about it some more, drop a comment down below. As always, this has been the Space Wizard, coming to you with the Space Wizard Holocron. May the Force be with you.